A very good morning to you who are joining us live on television and all the online platforms, plus our virtual audience that are joining us via the other platforms. We want to welcome you on this International Day of Democracy 2021. Yes, it is the 17th, but the International Day of Democracy was on the 15th, and we are marking it on this day. So the European Union delegation and the Embassy of Sweden here in Uganda, through the Drive for Democracy initiative, are holding this public discussion centered on research conducted by the Varieties of Democracy VDEM research in collaboration with the University of Gothenburg. Now, the EU-funded VDEM research, the Case for Democracy, supports the argument that democracy produces better development outcomes for economic growth and inclusion, social protection, poverty reduction and gender equality, health, peace and security, and combating climate change. This public discussion focuses on the first of these outcomes, that's economic growth and inclusion, and builds on the Case for Democracy, where previously, of course, the week in March 2021, during which the VDEM and the EU discussed this new evidence with a global audience. However, this particular discussion will follow the topic on how can strengthened democracy produce better outcomes for economic growth and inclusion in Uganda as we respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. We will, of course, be looking at the implications of the VDEM research for Uganda's development in the coming years, and we'll, of course, be exploring the following critical questions. What lessons can Uganda draw from the VDEM research, and what are the implications on the government's efforts to mitigate the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic? Which aspects of Uganda's democracy most need to be strengthened in order to achieve stronger and more inclusive economic growth? What institutions and processes need to be engaged for this to succeed? And how can the EU best support these efforts? Today, in this 2-hour public discussion, being broadcast on all these platforms mentioned earlier, on television and online, we will be, of course, looking at, does democracy cause economic growth, stability, and work for the poor, as the presentation from the VDEM research will indicate. We will, of course, be specifically looking and reflecting on the case for Uganda. So I want to welcome you to this public discussion, Making the Case for Democracy in Uganda, an event, as I mentioned, to mark the International Day of Democracy 2021 here in Uganda. It now gives me great pleasure to invite Her Excellency Maria Håkansson, the Ambassador Designate of Sweden to Uganda, to make her opening remarks. You're most welcome, Your Excellency. Round of applause, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, both present in the room and those following our event from homes and offices. This is actually the first time I'm delivering public remarks in my new capacity as Sweden's ambassador designate to Uganda, as I only arrived to your country 1 month ago. And I'm particularly pleased that the theme of our gathering today is a matter at the front and center of the Swedish government's foreign policy. The promotion of democracy and human rights has always been a part of the DNA of the Swedish foreign policy. But today, it has an even more prominent role in our work. 2 years ago, Sweden launched the Drive for Democracy, a global and cross-regional initiative aiming to promote and strengthen democracy and the rule of law worldwide. A key part of the Drive for Democracy is to support civil society and the right to freedom of expression, opinion, and information, online as well as offline. I'm pleased that Sweden is co-organizing this event with the EU delegation. The EU is a firm promoter and defender of human rights and democracy, across the world as well as within its own borders. The reason behind Sweden's Strive for Democracy initiative is simple. We are convinced that democracy is the best form of governance for stability and for human and economic development. And I wish to make 3 points to support my case. Democracy provides political accountability and therefore a mechanism to correct mistakes and to do better. Democracy ensures transparency and access to information, without which there can be no progress. Democracy enables everyone to be involved in building the future and allows for different voices to be heard and also respected, creating social cohesion and inclusion. Therefore, Sweden also support democratic development here in Uganda through the embassy and through our development cooperation for the benefit of Ugandans. Our cooperation partners here include, for example, the UN Human Rights Office, UN Women, International Development Law Organization, and also Democratic Governance Facility, DGF. Regretfully, the suspension of the DGF from February this year has had negative effects on the work of our partners, which include both civil society organizations and Ugandan state institutions, work that would have brought benefits for people all over Uganda. But I hope and I'm sure that we will come to a prompt conclusion with the government of Uganda, allowing for activities to resume. Let me also highlight another important aspect of our work. The Prime Minister of Sweden stated already in 2014 that he leads a feminist government. And Sweden, as a consequence, also, as the first country worldwide, pursues a feminist foreign policy. And I'm very happy to say that Sweden is by no way unique in this anymore, but at the time it was actually seen as something quite controversial even. But what does this mean? It means that women's rights are human rights, that gender equality serves all, men and women, boys and girls. It's about equal rights, equal representation, and access to resources. This benefits society as a whole, and it's also an integrated part of our work here in Uganda. Ladies and gentlemen, we are in the midst of a pandemic which has brought devastating human costs, new strains on our open societies, and disruption to economic activity. Our vulnerabilities have been exposed. Democracy, respect for human rights, and economic development have suffered during the pandemic in Uganda, in Sweden, in Europe, and elsewhere. The topic for today's event is how can strengthened democracy also produce better outcomes for economic growth and inclusion as Uganda responds to the COVID-19 pandemic. And with us today, we have researchers from University of Gothenburg and also very knowledgeable panelists to share their reflections on the research. To me, the most apparent case for how democracy and economic growth go hand in hand is the fact that democracy provides mechanisms for accountability that punish inadequate political performance and also a mechanism for a more equitable growth that reduces poverty. Also, for companies and business to grow and prosper, we need transparent, accountable, and predictable rules of the game to be in place. Rule of law underpins and enables resilient economic growth. Independent and well-resourced courts are fundamental cornerstones in democracies, but also bedrocks for economic growth. So I look very much forward to taking part of the research that will be presented, and also by our inspiring panelists. I hope you will excuse me that unfortunately I will not be able to be here in the room with you through the end, but I will for sure make use of all these new digital ways of participating in events. I guess there is something good also coming out of us forcing us to find new ways of interacting. And I think together we can learn and we can make a change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. We'll now move to our keynote presentation, The Case for Democracy, the link with economic growth. As I mentioned, the presentation from the VDEM policy brief will basically be answering the question, does democracy cause economic growth, stability, and work for the poor? Of course, a case in reflection to Uganda. May I now invite the Assistant Professor, Ms. Vanessa Alexandra, and Martin, Research Assistant, both from Varieties of Democracy, VDEM Institute at the University of Gothenburg, Sweden, to come and take us through the keynote presentation. You're most welcome.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen. Here you go. Okay. Thank you very much for the kind introduction to present and to participate in this Democracy Day Uganda. My name is Vanessa Alexandra Böse. I'm assistant professor at the VDEM Institute at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And with me today is Martin Lundstedt, who is a research assistant at the VDEM Institute. Now, Mr. Lundstedt and I are experts in cross-national democracy measurement, and we work at the VDEM Institute, which is the headquarters of the VDEM project. Now, what is this VDEM project? Before we jump right in, I want to say a few words about this. The VDEM project is a collaborative effort of about 3,500 people to create the world's largest data set on varieties of democracy. And what does that mean? So in total, we have about 30 million data points. But what does that mean? Well, I'll get into detail. We have a bit more than 50 indices and 473 indicators. So what that means is we break down the concept of democracy into little tiny aspects, into aspects that go down to the level of is there suffrage in the country? If so, how many % of the population are allowed to vote? Are civil society organization repressed? And if so, to which degree? So all sorts of different aspects are measured in our data set. And how do we measure that? Well, we don't just go around and say, what is it? Is it democracy, yes or no? No, it's quite more complicated than that. So when you look at those 473 indicators, what that means actually is in each country across the world where we measure democracy, we have a set of country experts. So these country experts are usually from that countries and from those countries, and they are scholars or academics or policymakers, practitioners or journalists that have proven their expertise in that country. And these country experts from us get a battery of questions that they need to answer on these low-level indicators, on questions like the one I mentioned earlier with the civil society, but also, for example, on the freedom of expression and media and access to alternative sources of information, all sorts of indicators, 473 questions. And then they answer these questions. And given that for each country we have more than 5 country experts, we use a measurement model to aggregate all of this up mathematically. So, for example, just let me go back there. So when we then aggregate this up, we have 473 indicators, and then we use these indicators and sum them together in a bit of a sophisticated way until we arrive at an overall assessment of the state of liberal democratic institutions in the country. So, for example, take the Liberal Democracy Index. This is one of our 50+ indices that you see here. The Liberal Democracy Index runs from 0 to 1 and shows whether the extent to which there are liberal democratic institutions in the country. So 1 being there are perfectly liberal democratic institutions, and 0 being there is a complete absence of liberal democratic institutions. Now, this Liberal Democracy Index is made up of about 40 to 50 of these lower level indicators. And I'm telling you this so you understand that the data we're presenting today is in fact something that many people all over the world have contributed. And once we talk about Uganda, what we will present to you is the assessment of our Ugandan country experts. If you're curious about VDEM, we're very transparent about the data set, so please come and visit our website. You see it on the left side of the screen here. You find it at v-dem.net. And there you also find more information about how we make the data, how this is aggregated, and so forth. So, and by the way, let me mention this because this is something really cool about our website. We also have graphing tools. And so you can explore our data using these graphing tools over time. So just, feel free to have a look. Now, before we jump into the case of Uganda, I want to give you a bit of an outlook on the global state of democracy. Every year, we add a new year of data to the VDEM data set. And with this new year of data set, we also publish what we call the democracy report. And that democracy report summarizes the main findings from this new year of data. And so today I'll give you a little bit of a snapshot of the democracy report 2021, which also is available on our website. So the main finding with this new year of data is that autocratization turns viral. And when we look at the level of democracy worldwide, we see that the number of countries that are autocracies, categorized by VDEM, and with it, the share of world population that is living in these countries, that's living in autocracies, has gone up significantly. So in 2010, there were 48% of the world population living in autocracies, and in 2020, we see that's already 68% of the world population. Now, what does that mean? I've talked a little bit already about the liberal democracy index here. You see it scaled between 0 being no democratic institutions and 1 being perfectly democratic. And here what we've plotted is in the black line, the world average over the past, 50-something years. And what this is a special average because it's population weighted. So essentially the black line, what you see here, is the level of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen. And if you look at 2020, and we sort of go back, we see that the world is now down to average levels of democracy where we were in 1990. And you could say, well, is this driven by particular regions? Unfortunately not. We see this decline in liberal democracy across all world regions. So the other lines that you see here are the different world regions, and we see democracy in decline over the past 5 to 10 years in most all of our world regions. And one other thing that is part of our VDEM data set is the regimes of the world measure, or the regimes of the world categorization. And with that categorization, every regime in the world is put in one of 4 categories. We use the categories 2 autocracy categories, closed autocracy and electoral autocracy, and 2 democratic categories, democracy, electoral democracy, and liberal democracy. The difference here, closed autocracy is usually a very, very strong autocracy that does not have elections. Electoral autocracies are autocracies that do have elections, but these elections are, for example, not multi-party or do not have a meaningful opposition. Then we have electoral democracies, which have elections that in our scheme are coded as free and fair, but they might lack constraints on the head of state or equality before the law and civil liberties. So, and once you have all of that, you're categorized as a liberal democracy. And if we look at the development of these 4 cases of regimes over time, then we see that in the last year, so in 2020, the majority of cases, or the most common regime category, was in fact an electoral autocracy. And we also see that over the past years, there has been a rise in the number of countries that are in both these middle categories. And this is a somewhat worrisome observation because we know that countries in the middle 2 categories are usually not as, the institutions in these countries are usually not as established or not as stable. And so these middle category countries are often more in more danger of civil conflict. So this is a slightly worrisome finding. So to sum up, This first finding in our democracy report is the level of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen in 2020 is down to levels last found around 1990, and electoral autocracy remains the most common regime type. Together with closed autocracies, they number 87 states, home to 68% of the world population. Now the next finding, the next big finding, so before we looked at levels of democracy, now let's look at changes. So are countries in the process of autocratizing or democratizing? And when we look at that, we notice that actually the share of the world population that lives in autocratizing countries, so in countries where autocratizing is going on a day-to-day basis, that share of the world population has gone up substantially. So in 2010, only about 6% of the world population was living in such countries, but in 2020, we're up to 34%. So let me show you a bit more of what that means. What I've plotted here for you is the number of countries that are in democratization episodes in blue and the number of countries in autocratization episodes in orange. And this going back to 1900. So what we see is what we in research call the first wave of democratization after World War I, then the second wave of democratizations after World War II, and the third wave of democratization around the end of the Cold War. But unfortunately, we also see something like 3 waves of autocratization. So we have the first wave of autocratization around World War II, we have the second wave of autocratizations in the 70s, and then quite late over the past 10 to 20 years, we see again a steep rise to numbers that we've never seen before in the last 120 years. We see a steep increase in number of countries affected by autocratization. And here, for the first time in 2012, we see that for the first time, we have a higher number of countries that is actually affected by autocratization. Now, you could say, is that really so important? Because really, I mean, it's not that much higher than the number of countries under democratization. Let us take a look at what this graph looks like if we account for the share of the population living in these countries. Here. This is what it looks like if I adjust it for population. So now we see, instead of the number of countries, we see the share of the global population that is living in countries with democratization or autocratization. And what we see here is that, in fact, as early as around the year of 2000, there is a far larger share of world population living in countries that are affected by autocratization. And in fact, in 2020, only 4% of the world population is living in countries that are democratizing, whereas 34% of the world population is living in countries that are autocratizing. And to provide a bit more perspective on why this is a very worrisome finding is, in a recent study that my co-authors and I have published in Democratization, we have looked at democratization episodes back to 1900, and we find that in a democracy, once autocratization has set in, only about 20%, 22, 23% of the cases have been able to avert democratic breakdown. So in other words, once autocratization sets in a democracy, around almost 80% in almost 80% of the cases that democracy breaks down. And the third wave of autocratization that I just pointed out in the earlier pictures actually already led to the demise of 36 democratic regimes. So it's quite a worrisome finding. And in addition to that, we've plotted here the top democratizing and autocratizing countries over the past 10 years. So in addition to this worrisome finding, another worrisome finding is that for the first time in recent years, we've had industrial, very powerful nations affected by autocratization. Among those are nations like the US, India, which turned into an autocracy last year, but also EU member states like Hungary and Poland that are for the first time very much affected by autocratization. So here we've noted down the top 10 autocratizers between 2010 and 2020. And what you see here already, this is the regime type in 2010, and this is the regime type in 2020. But several of those countries that were actually classified as democracies, like India, like Hungary, for example, have become electoral autocracies in the turn of the third wave of autocratization. So in sum, on the second finding, the third wave of autocratization is accelerating, now engulfing 25 countries and 34% of the world population. And the world's largest democracy turned into an electoral autocracy, India with its 1.37 billion citizens. Now, let me come to the last point. This is our last major point, because when we talk about this autocratization, an important piece of knowledge is to know what is the democratic space that is threatened the most. And our research shows that it's freedom of expression. The number of countries threatening freedom of expression has gone up from only 19 in 2010 to 32 in 2020. And here we have plotted a number of key democratic aspects, and we have plotted them in showing which of them or how many countries decline on these indicators in the period 2010 to 2020, and how many countries improve. So if the indicator is located on this 45-degree line, that means there has been no change. So in suffrage, there has been almost no change. But, and this is one that really stands out, freedom of expression is located on the far right-hand side. And this means that it's declining on 32 indicators while only increasing on 12. So this is the area that's been affected most. And here we look at the top 20 declining lower level indicators. So these are indicators that are actually coded by our country experts across the world for different countries. And we have listed them here according to how many countries this indicator was substantially declining in the period between 2010 and 2020. And what you see is the top 10 indicators. So the top 10 are down until this blue line. Of these top 10 indicators, 8 of them, the light blue, are freedom of expression and access to alternative sources of information. So those are things like, is the government exerting efforts to censor the media? Is the media self-censoring? Is there freedom of discussion for men and women? Are journalists harassed? And so on and so forth. Another indicator where you obviously see a big decline over the past 10 years is the repression of civil society organization. So to sum up, the threat of freedom of expression and media intensifies. 32 countries are declining substantially compared to only 19 just 3 years ago. And the repression of civil society is also intensifying. The VDEM data registers substantial deteriorations in 50 countries over the past 10 years. So again, if this sparked your curiosity, feel free to have a look at our democracy report. It's available on our website, v-dem.net. And now we'll turn to a closer inspection of Uganda, and I'll hand over to Mr. Lundstedt.
Thank you, Ms. Bose. My name is Martin Lundstedt, and I'm a research assistant at the VDEM Institute, and I will be presenting data from VDEM and the Pandemic Backsliding Project on Uganda today. So we can turn to the next slide. Here are some key points that I will bring up. VDEM categorizes Uganda as an electoral autocracy since 1996. Uganda's 2020 score on the Liberal Democracy Index, which Ms. Bose showed previously, has not significantly changed compared to 1990. Equality before the law and individual liberties especially has declined substantially in recent years. And Uganda's response to the COVID-19 pandemic included abusive enforcement, discriminatory measures, and restrictions to the media, making Uganda the 6th worst violator of democratic standards as the Pandemic Backsliding Project measures it. So here we have the Liberal Democracy Index in Uganda and its neighboring countries in the East African community from 1990 to 2020. And 0 here represents the lowest possible score, which would be a perfectly closed autocracy, and 1 would be the highest possible score, and that would be a perfect liberal democracy. And Uganda is the orange thick line we see here. So it started in 1990 at a score of 0.19, and in 2020 it has a score of 0.23, and that there has been, as you can see, no substantial change here on the Liberal Democracy Index score. It has also been lower than the sub-Saharan average, which was lower from 1992 and onwards. It's also lower than the neighboring countries Tanzania for the whole period, and lower than Kenya from 2001, which is the purple dashed line you see there. It is, however, higher than its 3 neighboring countries, Burundi, the pink solid line, Rwanda, which is the dashed light blue line, and South Sudan, which is the solid teal colored line. And if we turn to the next graph, we see some components of the Liberal Democracy Index. These are also indices composing various indicators. And if we start with the thick dark orange line, which is the Equality Before the Law and Individual Liberties Index, we see an increase in the early 90s at a highest score of 0.72 in 1995, but a strong decline from 2016 to 2020, and it is now at a score of 0.43. Looking at the dashed dark orange line, which represents clean elections, we see a decline in the late 90s and early 2000s, and a score in 2020 of 0.17. Looking instead at legislative constraints on the executive, here we have the light orange solid line here, and we see that it's a slight increase in the last 2 to 3 years. And it is at a score of 0.71 in 2020, but it is lower than the values we saw in the late 90s. Judicial constraints on the executive, which is the light orange dashed line, exactly, that one, it has increased steadily and gradually over the period, and the score in 2020 at 0.61 is the highest observed for these 30 years. And finally, the two remaining indices. Freedom of association is the neither dark nor light orange solid line. It rose substantially between 2003 and 2006, has since somewhat declined, and is, as of 2020, at a score of 0.49. And then we have the neither dark nor light freedom of expression, it's the dashed line. And we see an increase in the 90s and somewhat of an increase in the last 2 years, but at a score of 0.65, it is lower than it was during the 2000s. And I'm realizing that we might be, I'll go through this a little bit faster perhaps, and we can get back if there's any questions. This is a radar graph. So at the center of this is the lowest possible score, and we see at the outermost circle there are several indicators here. So the outermost circle represent the highest possible score. It's a scale from 0 to 4, and these are a first set of indicators comprising the Equality Before the Law and Individual Liberties Index we saw previously. And we show the score on these indicators for 3 years. So 1990 is the dashed blue line, 2010 is the solid blue line, and 2020 is the solid orange line. And what we see in this, I want to note that these are indicators that are separated by men and women, so there's liberties for men and liberties for women respectively. And what we see here is that between 1990 and 2010, we see an expansion of liberties. It increases on almost all indicators. But between 2010 and 2020, we see a contraction or decline in these liberties. So if we start at the right-hand side here, we see that freedom from forced labor, access to justice, and freedom of movement for men was strong and relatively strong, respectively, in 1990 and 2010. And property rights for men increased substantially to being most men enjoying most possible property rights. And on the left-hand side, comparing 1990 to 2010, we see that access to justice for women, freedom of movement for women, and property rights, not least, improved. Property rights improved a lot in these 20 years. And freedom from forced labor stayed the same, but at a relatively high level. Comparing instead 2010 to 2020, so the solid blue line versus the solid orange line, we see that on the right-hand side, freedom from forced labor for men, access to justice for men, and freedom of movement for men have all declined. Access to justice for men at the score of 2, for instance, represents access to justice only being occasionally observed, and there are problems in the access to justice for men. Property rights for men, however, stayed the same at that level. On the left-hand hand side, we see that the VIDM data notes that there have been declines on all 4 of these liberties for women. And access to justice is down at levels in 1990, so is freedom of movement for women. Property rights isn't down at levels in 1990, but it has declined substantially, and there are serious issues with property rights for a lot of women. And freedom from forced labor for women is lower than it was in 1990, and the score of 2 means that it is, while not widespread, not rare either. And we can turn to the next graph. Here we see another radar graph. So center means lowest possible score, outermost circle, highest possible score. And these are the remaining indicators on the Equality Before the Law and Individual Liberties Index. And these are measured jointly for men and women, so these are not separated by gender. And if we start at the top, we see that freedom from torture is at the same score of 1 for all these 3 years, which means that for all of these 3 years, torture has been relatively frequent, and that freedom is not at all well protected. Freedom from political killings, the next indicator, has improved in 2010 and 2020 as compared to 1990, but the score of 2 means that it is only somewhat upheld and that political killings occur occasionally. And then transparent laws with predictable enforcement, that there have been the same score for all of these 3 years at a score of 2, meaning that it's only somewhat transparent and predictable. Impartial public administration has declined in 2010 and 2020 as compared to 1990, and a score of 2 means that public officials only moderately follow the law. Freedom of religion was very strong in 1990 and 2010. It scored at the highest possible score. The decline to a score of 3 in 2020 means that it's mostly respected rather than fully respected. And freedom of foreign movement increased in 2010 and 2020 as compared to 1990, and the score of 3 also means that it's mostly respected. And here then we show data from the pandemic backsliding project, which was gathered by colleagues at the VIDM Institute. And it shows, or it measures 7 types of violations of democratic standards between March 2020 and June 2021. And these types of violations are listed here to the left in the graph. So there are discriminatory measures, violations of non-derogable rights, official disinformation campaigns, abusive enforcement, limitations on legislature, restrictions on media freedom, and no time limit on the measures taken. And all of these are just in relation to the COVID-19 response, so it's not a general assessment, but only what each country that they looked at, 144 countries, what was included in their COVID-19 response. And it was the scores were categorized into 4 types, so no violations, minor violations, moderate violations, and major violations, which we see down there at the bottom of the graph. And Uganda, according to the Pandemic Backsliding Project, scored major violations in terms of discriminatory measures in their pandemic response, major violations in abusive enforcement, and major violations in restrictions on media freedom. They also scored moderate violations in terms of having some lack of time limit in their measures against COVID-19, and minor violations in terms of official disinformation campaigns. There were, however, no violations in terms of non-derogable rights or limitations on the legislature in relation to the COVID-19 response. Together, this score made Uganda being ranked the 6th worst violator out of these 144 countries over the period of March 2020 to June 2021 on these 7 parameters or violations of democratic standards. Now, this the VIDM data and the pandemic backsliding project describes a pretty bleak situation in Uganda, and we then turn to next what would be the benefits or dividends of being a democracy. And for that, I hand it over again to my colleague, Ms. Bose.
Thank you, Martin. And I'll attempt to be brief here, but I really want to talk a little bit more about why we believe democracy has a good value apart from its intrinsic good value, but we believe firmly, and we know this is something that research has shown, democracy is also good for economic development, for human development, health, for climate change, and peace and security. And I'll give you a little bit of an outlook on that, focusing on economic growth. So this is one of the strongest findings in the literature that we know. For example, a recent study by Darren Ajamoli and co-authors estimates that once you democratize, your GDP goes up by about 20%. And this is a finding that we see again and again. So often we hear, but what about China? You know, China has spectacular growth. Yes, it does. And yes, it is the exception. So China is very, very much the exception. And it's not the case that autocracies do not grow, but it's the case that on average, democracies have stable, predictable, positive growth. Whereas in autocracy, and this is what you see here, this is a picture taken from an article by Karl-Henrik Knudsen from 2020. This is the average economic growth rates for democracies, and this is sort of the distribution of growth rates for autocracies. And we see that this distribution is slightly positive and for democracies and more to the left for autocracies. So the way this works and the mechanism behind this is that democracy acts as a safety net against more catastrophic economic outcomes. And we see that from 1990 to 2009, only 7% of democracies experienced negative growth rates, whereas over 30% of autocracies did. And about 1 in 20 autocracies had catastrophic negative growth rates of over 10%. And so this is democratic institutions sort of acting as a safety net at play here. And we want to talk a little bit more, because it's also the focus of this panel here, about the mechanism. How do these democratic institutions foster economic growth? And some of the clear mechanisms that research has laid open is that democracies on average provide higher investments in human capital. So there are higher levels of education, and then that perpetuates itself into more growth. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. Democratic institutions also act as a safety net against predatory extractive rulers. Democracies provide more reliable property rights protection, which is, of course, together with sound courts, a prerequisite for economic growth and economic activity in general. And democracies include a higher share of their population in the economic market. So by offering more gender equality, more inclusion, you have a broader set of ideas of people that can contribute. So both in terms of ideas, but also actually in terms of actual labor. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So first of all, this idea of democracy and human capital, this channel, how does that work? Well, we know that democracies spend much more on social protection. From a recent study by Mansoub Murshid and co-authors in 2020, we know that going from no democracy to full democracy increases your spending on social protection over 100%. And we also know that democracies are more inclusive and more gender equal. And this has important implications for economic growth. As I said earlier, if you have just purely a higher number of people participating in economic activity, and you have a broader set of ideas, that perpetuates into higher levels of growth. In terms of another part of how democratic institutions contribute to better growth is because the people that live in democracies on average live longer, have higher life expectancy. So a recent study by Tom Bolicki and co-authors looked at adult life expectancy, and this is the trajectory of life expectancy if a country democratizes at period 0, and this would be the trajectory of life expectancy if that country were to stay in autocracy. So we know, and this is very clear and comes out again and again, this is not only true for life expectancy, but also for infant mortality. So we know infant mortality is about 94% lower in democracies versus autocracies. So when the people who are in the market, and there are more people in the market contributing ideas, contributing their work power, these people are also healthier and are able to work longer. So both of these things contribute to actually generating higher levels of growth. And that's all from us. I hope we didn't go over time too much, and thank you again for the invitation.
I was wondering if we really were not appreciative of Vanessa and Martin. Another round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. My initial thoughts, Vanessa, was that you were denying us the opportunity to look at your beautiful face, and I'm glad that at the end you did turn on your video and we were able to see you. So thanks to you, Vanessa, and Martin, for a job well done. We will, of course, be looking at the case for Uganda and some of the highlights from your research in this presentation with my panel discussion. But I also need to mention that those of you who are joining us virtually, you will be able to contribute during our Q&A session. And I'm hoping the Secretariat will be able to share with us those questions for us to ask the panelists, but also provide for the greater audience some of the highlights of your presentation and research. We now move to the panel discussion, and we are really keeping within the time we have, and I am hoping we will manage this. We have 1 hour for the panel discussion and Q&A. So allow me invite our panelists, and I'll begin with the lady on the panel, Alana Kembabazi, an expert on socio-economic rights and is passionate about pro-poor economic growth and development in Uganda. She works with the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights, ISAR, which uses research, advocacy, targeted litigation, and community engagements to advance economic social rights in Uganda, particularly for the poor and the vulnerable. At ISAR, a program manager, she oversees work on the economic inclusion and fiscal policy and work done on the right to health. She's coordinating a citizens campaign, Enough is Enough, reclaiming public services for inclusive and sustainable social inclusion, economic recovery from COVID-19. She has written and presented on social protection, universal health coverage, and worked on human rights in Uganda and abroad. And Ms. Kembabazi received the Juris Doctor from Yale Law School and a Bachelor of Arts in Government from the Wesleyan University, Connecticut, USA. That's the rich profile of Alana. A round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. And then I'll move to Professor Gerald Karieja. He's the Dean and Associate Professor of Public Administration, School of Management Science at the Uganda Management Institute in Uganda. He's also the Extraordinary Professor of Public Administration, Northwest University, and Senior Scholar, University of Lusaka. Karieja is a facilitator at the Uganda People's Defense Forces Senior Staff and Command College, Kimaka. He has vast experience in research, consultancy, training, and practice in the area of governance, management, leadership, and public administration, spanning over 20 years with various organizations and countries. Lately, his increased interest in leadership. I'm not sure that means you're going to join politics. Well, increased interest in leadership and management for quality improvement in health service delivery. Karieja holds a bachelor's degree specializing in public science and public administration from Makerere University, Uganda, and a master's and PhD in public administration from the University of Bergen, Norway. I could go on and on. His profile is so rich. And allow me, Professor, to cut it there. Okay. I'll then now move to Dr. Moses Kagwa. Moses Kagwa works as the Director of Economic Affairs Department in the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, and prior to his posting, he was the Commissioner Tax Policy Department. He was posted to when he joined the ministry, rising through the ranks to become the head. And he has vast experience in fiscal policy, law, economics, energy, trade, investment, and finance and policy analysis. He participates on the IMF World Bank annual meetings, in which he has made a number of presentations on topical issues affecting the economy in Uganda, and is a graduate, of course, of Makerere University, master's degree majoring in taxation from the University of Florida, and has participated in a lot of tax forums, like the OECD Global Forum on DTAs and the UN ad hoc committee meetings on DTAs and the East African community. I could go on and on. You're Uganda's chief negotiator for DTAs, and he's spearheading the BEPs. You know, this is all very huge jargons, so allow me to stop there, because I may have to explain what BEP is and DTA is in Uganda. So ladies and gentlemen, this is our panel, and round of applause. I will be joining them very shortly, but I wanted maybe to begin with you, Moses. First of all, your immediate reaction to the research that's been shared to us by Vanessa and Martin. Lots of lessons to learn, but also key highlights in where we need to make some improvements. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, and good evening, good morning, everybody. Those ones here who are here physically and the ones on various forums. Yes, I've received the research, and I think I would want to concentrate on the issue of democracy as we see it in our lens in Uganda, because everybody may be seeing it differently. But we are looking at democracy as good governance, looking at democracy as transparency, and we are looking at democracy as accountability. And from that perspective, I think Uganda is doing very, very well. And it's leading a lot to the things we are doing to make sure that we improve our economy. One is that we have a very strong citizen participation in the budget, and the budget is the instrument that defines where government wants to go. So we have a very strong participation. When we are starting with the budgeting process, we involve the whole of government to come up and design the theme and where we want to go. Then we involve local governments. We go ahead and involve civil society, because they are all part of us, and the civil society represents the voiceless, as we can call them, because not everybody can come and participate. Then we have the academia giving us research findings. And then after all these processes, we go through cabinet to say, yes, this is what the Ugandans do want, and this is the theme that we are going to have for next year, and these are the priority areas we'll have picked. We go to cabinet. Cabinet, of course, makes some changes, endorses them through the budget framework paper. We go to Parliament that time. So in Parliament, they scrutinize our programs that we want to undertake, and then they give us recommendations on improving the budget. We go back on the drawing board, take into account the recommendations of Parliament, and then we present the budget to Parliament. And it's very participatory. Everybody comes, goes to Parliament and present their cases, and eventually the budget is passed. And this is the instrument that we use to try and get out to the people, to have them participate. And we are looking at what happens. And I think for all these years, if you have looked at the growth rates of Uganda pre-COVID, we have been growing very well at about 6 to 7% over the period. It's only when COVID came in 2019, 2020, that our growth reduced to 3%. We have been looking at what are we doing about poverty reduction, because the numbers are there. So if we are going into that and say, yes, what has been the result of this participatory approach in Uganda? We used to have very high poverty rates. They went down to 24.5, then 19.2, and then 21.5, because in 2017-18 we had a bit of a challenge where there was a lot of drought, and some people fell back into poverty. But poverty has been going down, and it would have been much lower this period we are talking about now if it had not been for the pandemic. So most of the things that you actually see are results of a government which is accountable to its people, which is looking at what should be the priorities that go on. We have, for example, been providing money for the elderly because through the SAGE, and I think this year we are making a provision for 120 billion to cater for this elderly. And this is a government that I think is responsible to its people. And these things should be coming out. Responsibility. We have provided funding for the Youth Livelihood Fund. We've been trying to look at these youth who are not employed and what can we do. On top of that, there are new funds like the Emioga for the talent groups, where last year we provided 260 billion. And this year we are continuing to provide 100 billion. These are people who couldn't actually go and access financing from the normal financial institutions. We have provided 60 billion to SACCOs, because there are people who can borrow from SACCOs. We provided money to make sure that at least they can recover from this pandemic. And we are still thinking, as a responsible government, what can we do to really assist our people in this economy, to make sure that they move away from poverty, because we are really looking at that.
Okay.
We want the socio-economic transformation of this country.
All right.
So all the things we are doing are geared towards that.
All right. Thank you very much, Moses. I'll come back to you because you still speak, and most of the issues you're speaking to right now, especially on the government programs, is issues to do with inclusion, social inclusion. But I wanted to come to Professor Karieja. You know, looking at the VDEM research, I want us to speak to you know, where we've come from. And I was, you know, clearly looking at the comparison to the early 2000s. And we have made, you know, some, you know, dives in some of the areas of research that have been shared. But, you know, what is very clear is that, you know, we still do well in areas of, you know, freedom of expression and association, and it captures where we are at with the rule of law. But your quick reactions to the research.
Thank you so much, and greetings to our viewers. Pleasure to be here. One, I think that in the main, the findings seem to resonate with what we observe in this country in terms of significant strides of economic growth. I want to agree with my colleague here, but at the same time underscore that the pace of growth has not been necessarily in harmony with democratic deepening or strengthening. I want to appreciate the view that we have had some significant democratic deficits. And if you notice, around the time when we were making a new constitution, there was a lot of discourse in this country, and many of the indices were going up. But after that, in terms of practice, I think we have had some shortfalls along the way. Though I would say that in terms of policy and legal architecture, I think as a country we have sufficient policy legal framework, but the challenge is still with the practice or the development of a democratic culture. A number of explanations, but I think one of them is we have atomized democracy to a few things. One, participation, involving people, but not taking so much effort in to what extent, how, and to evaluate the impact of this. Two, the question of elections. We seem to be highly preoccupied with procedural democracy, elections, representation, and less preoccupied with substantive elements of democracy until once in a while when, for example, the head of state comes up and says, security agencies, you are being so brutal, and so on and so forth. The third general observation I have on this is the question of locality. We are a decentralized government, so one would expect that our democratic credentials would resonate with this. And I'll just use three basic principles that would illustrate that. One, the question of subsidiarity, having local things largely solved locally. The other one is the question of freedom. When you have decentralization, you are assuming that you are giving local governments freedom from the center and freedom to self-determination. I'm not using the word self-determination to mean independence or cut-off. When you look at this, until recently the parliament, if you noticed, there has been a lot of reversals of re-centralization until recent parliament is saying, wait a minute, we need to make some of these changes and maybe local revenue stays and so on and so forth. So I think that dysfunctionality there creates some challenges. Addressing again myself to the study, I think that with time there is need to reflect on some of the indices that are being used by the study. One of them that quickly came to my mind is the question of egalitarianism. Egalitarianism is largely a cultural question. Uganda, in my study, I found out it's a high power distance cultural profile. So to expect it to be egalitarian when it is culturally high power distance, I think to me is likely to give fallacious results. So the question is, how do you promote democracy in a higher power distance culture? So I think sometimes also the concepts of democracy need to be localized and contextualized. Now, my final point is, in the general, going forward as a nation, in terms of this study, if we specifically address ourselves to this study, let me use just one example. Government has now chosen to use the parish development model for purposes of service delivery and trying to clear the bottlenecks within the service delivery mechanism, where I think service delivery has been a challenge. Now, if we are to go that way, then we should appreciate that governments are there to improve the well-being of each and every individual and to increase their opportunities to become better. There is a tendency to overemphasize wealth creation, and I don't think that many human beings, their primary reason for existence is to become wealthy. I think there is a falsification there. I think we would rather focus on the well-being of individuals, ability for me to think freely, to associate with those I want to associate with, and to become better. Becoming better does not necessarily mean being wealthy. It's not that I'm against wealth or people becoming wealthy, but I think we are more interested in having better housing, better education, better than having increased individual income. So I think that we need a more holistic approach that promotes both economic growth and development, and at the same time increase democratic culture and values in a contextualized environment.
Thank you very much, Prof. Alan, I'll come to you because coming from a civil society space and having looked at the research by VDEM, quick lessons we can draw from that for Uganda.
Yeah, thank you. I believe that we've often made it seem like democracy is separate from the lived realities of our people. And as civil society, we wonder, how are these discussions resonating at that level? And I think it's because of the way we measure democracy. I personally was disappointed to see that when you talk about, impact on growth or social protection, they're byproducts of democracy. I think they're integral to the democratic project. And I think that it's not an accident that we have seen a rise in autocracy in other countries like the US, because they've ignored those things. Therefore, they can't be considered democracies in true sense. I think in countries like ours, citizens in defining democracy should move beyond these periodic electoral cycles and rituals we do, and all of the violence or not thereof that comes with that, and also look at the everyday, local, direct, participatory accountability mechanisms of democracy. And it means moving beyond lip service. I had Commissioner Kagwa and we were together yesterday, so he's going to laugh. But talking about participatory budgeting. But is the budgeting participatory? You see, the proof of it is in the pudding. If it's participatory, we should see the aspirations of the people reflected in the budget. How then do we explain a situation where health, education, social protection have periodically been underfinanced in this budget? Even in a pandemic when we should be styling up. When we get COVID-19 and you see a supplementary budget that comes and security is top, yet we are in a health emergency right now. And people end up having to pay to deposit land titles or run wherever because the public health systems are under-equipped perpetually, right? Can we say that there is democracy when there is rising inequality? Forget COVID. Our Gini coefficient has been rising for so long. If you look at 2012, 0.40 to 0.43643 in 2016, right? But we don't have to look at the data. We can just look now on the streets as you're driving here. The kids that are on the streets right now, when a mother sends her child to the street, who is about, I saw one 5 years old yesterday, to go beg, it's because they have no choice. At the same time, we're seeing mansions cropping up with very little accountability for COVID-19 funds. So when we think about democracy, we need to begin to interrogate, what is it that constitutes democracy? As advocates for things like strong public services like health and education, we believe they are an expression of democracy because they embody a collective commitment to solve the economic, social, and ecological challenges of our times. And their presence enables the citizens' participation in the collective project of building a more equal and fair society. Because at its heart, democracy should be about equality. We say we are equal before the law, but you have to look at the practical, everyday realities of people. That's when equity comes in. Are they able to participate? Are women, for example, really able to hold people accountable when their space of participation is shrinking? When there is less access to information, can a community say, without access to, for example, arguments, or can they say, these are the issues we want to have raised, right? And when you go to courts and you run to the courts, because I think we often forget that justice is an integral part of this. When you run to the courts, say for an access to information request, it takes years sometimes. When you run to the courts because your mother died giving birth and yet money was allocated the health budget, it takes years for a decision to even come out. And so I think we need to get back to basics. I think we need to begin to think about how democracy in of itself is practical. Because I think over and over, and on World Democracy Day, I was really frustrated because every year, even as a student of government, you study about democracy. But if it has no meaning in the everyday realities of people, if we don't make an effort to actually begin to think through how to ensure that our citizens' aspirations are reflected, we are in trouble. There is a group of people right now that is continuously excluded from the polity of the state. We have young people that cannot get jobs. We have people who feel like the budget never reflects them. I was actually telling Commissioner Kagwa before we walked up that we're in a very dangerous situation, that the possibility of social unrest grows every single day. We don't have to look too far. We can look at South Africa. What happens when there's inequality, when there's continuous exclusion from social services like health or education? And so I would want to see this reflected in how, like, a true commitment to participation, accountability, making sure the will of the people is reflected in the budgeting, the financing. When you take out loans in our name and ask for taxes, making sure the will of the people is reflected there. But also in the researchers that talk about it. We need to stop talking about democracy in a very narrow way, because we make it seem like it's a Western project. And for so long, that's how it has been conceptualized. And then we have the debate on whether or not elections happened, whether or not there was violence, and those are important considerations. But we then don't question why elections can happen and government officials or whoever wants a ticket can go to the deepest villages, but they cannot reach them there with service delivery.
Okay. I see where we're going, and I like that we highlight the challenges, but I would want us to interest ourselves in the way forward and how we can get out of this situation that we are in, given the research that we have. And Professor, I want us to begin there, because we want to look at the aspect of Uganda's democracy that must need to be strengthened to address the issues of inequality and the issues of inclusion and cohesion. Are there areas that you pick out, even in the research, that we are able to strengthen so that we actually then address Alana's concerns?
Yeah. One, for example, now there are very many reforms actually that have taken place at state level or at bureaucracy level as experiments to improve service delivery. For example, the current one is the parish development model, the program-based budgeting, and so on. The beginning point is picking lessons from our history, even the recent history. Before the parish model was developed, we had the Millennium Villages. We have the presidential initiative on the model village. We had the Korean-sponsored ESMV Samdung villages. Much as we said now that the unit of service delivery be the parish, it's not clear how these other experiments informed the parish model. Now, when you raise questions of accountability, we have the barazas under the Office of the Prime Minister as one of the components for monitoring and evaluation. To what extent are they going to be resurrected to inform the PDCs and how they work at that level? Two, how are we going to avoid earlier accidents? I'll just give you a simple example. There are a number of projects, he's aware, which were discovered to be at central government level. For example, the market in Lukaya and others, abattoirs elsewhere, that were conceived, implemented at the center with minimal or symbolic involvement. So I think the deeper questions are, one, if we create structures, let's not look at them only in terms of their economic efficiency and effectiveness, but also in the extent to which they deepen and strengthen democratic values. Two, the other question is about civic competences. The ability of the citizens to be aware, involved, and actively participate. We know that the lead agency in civic education is the Uganda Human Rights Commission, a large beneficiary of the DGF that has been talked about. The question is, as a country, do we want to retain that mandate to the Uganda Human Rights Commission, or do we want to integrate it into the curriculum like it were before, when we had civics education, when we had political education? That's another way forward. Education, literacy is a very strong and powerful tool. The other element is about legality versus legitimacy. We have reduced, in many instances, democracy to legality. Where there's a problem, we fix it by the law. Where there's a problem, we use the law to fix it. But some questions are moral, and they have to be responded to morally. Some questions are political. They have to be responded to politically. What do I mean here? It's not that everything that is legal, that is legitimate. And democracy is about legitimacy. So the study was pointing about reduced trust in public institutions. Trust is about acceptance. It's about a relationship. So how do you improve that relationship? You improve it partly through transaction. When a person goes to a school, I'm a teacher, he's expecting that you teach them, evaluate them, and grade them. If I go to a health center, I expect that I'll be welcomed, I'll be given where to sit, and then I'll be given medicine. So in some places, yes, we are improving these things, but in other places we are not. The other one is about how we measure our own achievements. I know that very many people say numbers don't lie, but there are also those of us who think that numbers are the best instruments to use for lying. So I don't want to delve so much into that debate, but as we evaluate people's well-being and choices and improvement, this preoccupation of meeting targets, hitting them by 100%, if you have achieved 100% or 60%, and yet certain people are experiencing deficiencies, then there is a challenge. The last point I want to make is I appreciate what is going on in Parliament now. The ideas by the two leaders in Parliament. The first one is the idea by the leader of opposition to have an opposition legislative agenda. People may have different views about it, but for me, that there is an attempt to aggregate interests that are over and above the constituency, over and above the party, and over above the political parties in the opposition is a good step forward. The other one is the idea by the Speaker that let's look at our critical legislative agenda. These are elements that strengthen democracy. They are saying this is a forum. We do not want to replace the executive or do what they are supposed to do, but as we legislate, as we have oversight, as we allocate money, what are our priorities? And this should be translated into also lower level legislatures. That is the local councils. The other one is to revisit the whole machinery of service delivery. We are now saying, let's go to the parish. So what are we talking about the village? What are we talking about? Let me just use the question of the judiciary. The judiciary is saying we would like to have alternative dispute mechanisms. We would like to have local courts or local judicial elements involved, and we would like to have a magistrate at every local council 3. Now, that debate is in isolation of the parish development model. So my argument is that let's have a synergy, a whole of government synergy that looks at how we are going to integrate all these things and move together. But as long as we have isolated instruments and thinking that the budget will fix them, my view is that it will do something good, but would do greater if, for example, that level of integration of policy, the integration of service delivery, prioritization is highly structured and involving as many people as possible, not in terms of numbers, but through representation.
All right, I honestly applaud you for that, because you touched on what would have been my next question for you, on the institutions that we must work with. At least we must be able to identify that can help in strengthening most of the areas you've been speaking to. But Moses, let me come to you, because Prof did speak to most of the issues that I wanted you to speak to on what we need to strengthen in order for us to have a more inclusive economic growth as a ministry. I agree, in your budgeting process you're trying to do the bottom-up approach, but unfortunately on implementation it's the top-down approach, and that is where the problem is, and so there is a huge disconnect, like Alana was saying. So how then do we help strengthen your capacity as an institution that really manages the economics of this country to be able to provide, or at least strengthen your aspiration for economic inclusiveness?
Thank you, Maurice. Of course, every time there's something new to learn. And there are certain things we have realized. For example, that leaving money at the center, if you're going to build schools, for example, in districts and in parishes, and then you say this money should remain at the center, the Ministry of Education, that would lead to delays. There's been a lot of bureaucracies that is leading to delays. So as one of the delivery mechanisms, we want this money to go directly, not even through Ministry of Local Government, but directly to where it is supposed to be utilized. In that way, that will remove some of the governance issues we have had, and we concentrate on that very area where this money is going. We have also looked at issues of where is government. I think Professor touched it. Sometimes people don't see government, they don't feel government. Sometimes even when you talk about the rosy growth rates, we are being asked, who is going to eat GDP? So for us, we want to see services down the people. Yes, So we are moving. That's why you saw that we've moved through the parish development model, which we are starting now, to say let services be provided at the parish and let everybody know. So what are we starting with in this journey? We have looked at the parishes in this country. There are about 10,560. And we are making sure that in each parish there is a parish chief. Some of them, about 5,000, didn't have. So the first thing is to recruit the parish chiefs. And then we collect information on each and every parish and see how we are going to make sure that all the programs we are going to take, all the activities, are linked to the parish. In that way, we think it will be more participatory and the people would actually feel and see government, because now we are going down to the people. And for this, we have talked sometimes, said, oh, but this is top, bottom. But look at NDP3. It was a very well-researched document. Everywhere, so many people were involved. And we came up with a national development plan, which we want to implement, though it has been affected by COVID-19, and we may have to change some of the parameters. But this is what we are trying to follow, and saying, yes, this is national consensus on how we are going to develop this country. And I think this should really be applauded and say, yeah, this country, there is a vision where we want to move. Thank you.
All right. So I'll come to you, Alana, and speaking to an area that Professor Kareja talked to, and he picked out Parliament as one of the institutions that is beginning to chart a different, way of addressing issues of inclusion and even bringing the community or the people into the conversation. And so I would be asking you, what are the other institutions? You could go back to Parliament, but what are the other institutions that we must be looking out to be able to begin providing the basic platform for people to feel like they're a part of government?
I think there is this tendency, again, to think that governance is for government.
Yes.
And I very strongly disagree. It's an unfortunate trend in this country. If you look at basic things like health, at each health facility there should be a health unit management committee. There should be a school management committee. There's different ways in which the community is supposed to be involved. And Uganda is very good at drawing up these things. Even parish development model sounds great. Again, I'm skeptical only because I rarely see it practiced. And so what ends up happening, we find that, for example, health management committees were often not trained, didn't understand their role. Same with school management committees. Organizations like ISA go and train them, but you can't train all of them across the country. It's ad hoc. Depending on when you get financing, this is government's role. And the role of the community cannot be overstated. Recently, ISA has these community advocates, regular people in the community it has empowered to monitor, because especially now with COVID, we're just not there. And they came and stopped the commissioning of a school because the block had been built, but built to substandard. And they said, this is now a mockery. Like, no. Everyone had gathered. And that shows you the importance of having the community at the front of this. But how does the community get to have this? They must have access to information. Basics. Right now with COVID-19, how many people know what's even in these loans, what is supposed to be financed? The World Bank, for example, is getting a lot of money. How many people know this is supposed to go towards this in health or this in education, such that if they see something funny happening, they're the first ones to be up in arms? How many actually know what is in the budget? And then the areas where the government has refused to give access to information, around things like oil agreements. And then there is repression sometimes for those of us who question, particularly around resources. I remember even just about vaccines earlier on this year, asking questions about why we're paying, was purportedly going to pay $7 per dose higher than every other. I remember before going on a radio show, someone said, you know, we've been urged to make sure there's no anti-government messaging. Questioning the price of vaccines is anti-government messaging. But there are others who face repression, like communities in Fort Portal who are trying to make sure that their crater lakes were not basically given off to an investor. And in fighting for that deed, others around oil, and then all the others. So we need to create, if we are really serious about accountability, about democracy, about value for money. You can debate whether or not you want to be autocratic or democratic, but I'm sure everyone can agree that we need value for money. On that, if you're serious about it, you must make sure that you are enabling the communities who you're saying you work for, because it is for the people. It's supposed to also be by the people. They're not supposed to be passive recipients in this. So for me, ensuring that you've enabled them through access to information, providing platforms for meaningful participation, and an environment that does not retaliate against those who ask questions is very important.
So thanks, Alana. So I see where you're coming from, and speaking to where the professor was already saying. So we look at parliament, we look at our courts of law, we look at the local governments, and these are areas we must be able to strengthen for community participatory engagement. And if you're just joining us and you're watching this public discussion on making the case for democracy that is actually brought to you by the European Union and the Embassy of Sweden here in Uganda, we are live on all the social media platforms, and you can follow this conversation on the NTV Uganda YouTube page, but also those of you who are joining us virtually, we will be now taking some questions, and I want to open it up for those of you who are here who, if you want to ask, there is a microphone on each table and a sanitizer we have provided, so that in case you're done you can sanitize your hands if you're worried about the microphone itself. But also, in case you're watching virtually, we will be taking some of your questions on on Zoom, so we can actually be able to ask. But we are specifically speaking to how can we strengthen democracy to produce better outcomes for economic growth and inclusion here in Uganda as we respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, quick questions. I saw, yes, please, your name and, sorry.
My name is Moses Isoba. I'm the Executive Director of the Uganda National NGO Forum. Two very quick questions. And let me start with a quote from the Permanent Secretary of Treasury. He recently said that the legitimacy of a government is its ability to provide decent jobs and public services. And what we do see in this country is that when you are in employment, like for 2 weeks, you are considered to be employed. And never do we talk about decent jobs. So I would just really like to ask Commissioner Kagwa what his take is, because what I really see, we are in a situation of well-being economics versus economics of brick and mortar. We see, what Arana has been mentioning too, a rise of infrastructure, but the social indicators in this country continue to remain depressingly poor. And you out on the streets or you get into the communities, the social indicators are depressingly poor. So how do we reconcile economic growth with these depressingly poor social indicators? And my last quick comment is also about and Prof talks about this, about legitimacy and legality. What I know is that once the budget is passed, it is law. But what we actually see in this country is an incremental or perpetual supplementary budget requests. And this in a way minimizes budget credibility. This in a way means that the government is not truly wedded to the Public Finance Management Act. So I just really want again to hear, how do we reconcile when we talk about democracy, but at the same time we're talking about breaking the law?
Thank you very much. I needed to switch on my mic after you've switched off yours because of the feedback. Thank you so much, Moses. And please don't demote Moses. He's a director, not a commissioner. So I am careful when you're talking to government officials. You must be careful about their titles. He's at a higher level than a commissioner. So, Moses, I have protected you on that one. I also need to mention that both Vanessa and Martin are available on Zoom to be able to speak to some of the areas of the research. In case there's another question, I just need to, before I come back to, yes, please.
Samuel Guma from the radio network. I have two comments. I just looked up at the data provided by the researchers, and it's impressive. Too many data points. But when I looked up the 7 fastest growing economies in the world as of now, only 2 fall in the category that the researchers would categorize as liberal democracies. 5 out of the 7 would fall in the category that you'd call either what the researchers called autocratic electoral autocrats or full autocrats. And that got me thinking about how we look at all these indices, indicators, data points, and so on, and sometimes using local, because we also use local experts and journalists. Most times these refer to people who have also had a Western education and have understood how these indices are interpreted in the Western context. And I think we need to be careful, because sometimes without context, this data is at best useless, at worst totally inapplicable. And I would like to agree with Alana that, you talk about democracy and development and you do not have the face and the voices of the people, you are just simply academic. But that's not because I do not agree with academics. Because if it went for the academics, some of us would never have known what some of the excellencies, ambassadors in our countries, CIA and others have been agreeing with our governments that eventually affect how our democracies move forward or backwards, eventually that determine how countries get forward in democratic dispensations and then backwards suddenly. Eventually you have coups. We are lucky we haven't had one here, but I've been looking up the problems with West Africa countries, especially the Francophone countries, and I've realized that majority of places where there have been coups, the coup leaders or the people who overthrew governments happen to be married to people from places where their colonial masters came from. That aside, I would really like to applaud the researchers and the people who have contributed to this research. And I think as we look at the forward movement and backward movement of Uganda's democracy, we just need to put the people at the center, just like Alana and the good professor and Dr. Kagwa have said. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guma. Vanessa, I think you will speak to Vanessa or Martin, because Martin, you made the case for Uganda. Vanessa, you could speak to Guma's, comment on his first reaction on the data that's shown, and including what he's just Googled, that speaks to the, autocracy and electoral democracies. But I'll also come to Prof. And Prof, I wanted us to look at something that Crispin Kaheru shared, and he said, as we commemorate the International Day of Democracy, let's challenge ourselves to build our own homegrown brand of democracy that works. African policymakers should consciously and continuously study various indigenous African societies for valuable democratic principles and practices to be adapted to reflect contemporary African situations for better governance and development. Crispin Kaheru is now a designated member of the Uganda Human Rights Commission that you spoke to, Prof. Alana, this sounded a lot like civil society language, and so it probably relates with you. Prof, let's begin there, especially with the concerns of Moses and even Samuel here, before we go to Moses and Alana on quick reactions on that.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. On the question of legality versus legitimacy, we all understand warfare, guns and whatever. But there's also another front, lawfare, using laws to fight. So in order to undermine democracy or to manipulate democracy or to stunt democracy, people use lawfare, legal maneuvers, legal fixing. And it's like when you argue, but that's the law. Go to courts. You have the freedom and the liberty to, judiciary is independent. So we have to question the laws, who sponsors them, who benefits, why, how. It shouldn't be just a matter of, it has worked elsewhere, we have benchmarked. I'm not trying to answer the question Guma raised.
Yes.
But when you look at elections and you read post-election reports, you will be amazed about how quick we adapt to political maneuvers that were done in Hungary, in Turkey, in Azerbaijan, in Venezuela, in Brazil. They couldn't have gone to the same school, but they pick what works for political intentions. So we have to question deliberately laws and the whole judicial system. Because of time, I won't elaborate beyond that unless you don't resonate with this. And then, in terms of legitimacy, the question to the population or to the person is, yes, the law is there. I don't have evidence beyond reasonable doubt. But I'm aware that I was not involved in this act. I'm aware that if I was a thief and you have got me, you don't have to first tear my ears. And then I get a lawyer to go and ask for me to be released because I've been detained. So the practice of the law, the practice of the policy should be consistent with this, the aspirations of the people. And where we find laws offending, we let them down. Now, on the question of indigenous democracy.
Yes, very quickly.
I was hinting on it. That's why I talked about the question of context. Even when we were developing indices, I used, for example, an issue of culture. When I did a study, my studies have shown that Uganda is a higher power distance area. And you are saying egalitarianism is a measure of democracy. So you cannot measure me against what I'm not and expect to get a different result.
All right.
Two, when I was talking about, for example, if we say we are going to have the parish development model, I don't know whether it is a Ugandan issue or elsewhere, but we are saying relate it with the barazas. Relate it with the budget allocations. What does democracy mean to us? If you are at the LC3, government talking about magistrates at that level, but it's also talking about alternative dispute mechanism. It's talking about local courts. Do we have Mato Oputu at LC3? That is infusing our values into the global ideal that we have appreciated as democracy.
All right. Thank you very much, Prof. Vanessa, if you can hear me, I had wanted you to speak to Guma's comment, and he raises a critical point on the issue of, if, for example, you measured economic growth on the African continent, the top 3 countries that are probably growing at the highest rate are either autocratic or autocracies, or democracies, call them electro-democracies. And so is it economics that works for only autocracies and not for the democracies that we want? Vanessa?
And you're absolutely right. If we look at the spread, at the distribution of economic growth across autocratic countries, we see a huge variety. So we see a number of countries like China that have this spectacular growth. But on the other side, we see a number of countries that have very detrimental growth rates that are catastrophic. And this side, unfortunately, is so much bigger. So this side is so much bigger, and then you have these few exceptions. So I would encourage you to, rather than looking at the top 3, the sort of economic growth countries, also look at the bottom 3 or look at the bottom 30, and you'll see a far larger share, I mean, by far larger share autocracies than democracies. And I also want to pick up a topic that has been on the panel again and again, and this is sort of the definition of democracy. And there I absolutely agree. So I think it's really important to get an idea of democracy beyond the electoral procedure. And this is at the heart of VDEM. At the heart of VDEM is, we say, democracy is not only about elections. Elections are certainly one part of it, but with it go things like, are civil society organizations repressed? Is there freedom of association? Do people have access to justice? Do men and women have access to justice? These types of things. And I mean, and there I also agree with you. You have to find a way to implement this in Uganda. We cannot tell you, how this is best implemented in Uganda. You are the experts on Uganda. We can tell you what our country experts from Uganda, how they assess the situation in Uganda, and then possibly you can use that to sort of identify democratic spaces where you can improve, and so on. And related to that, I want to pick up on one of the comments. One of the panelists said, numbers don't lie and yet are the best possibility to lie. And we agree that this is a problem, and this is why the VDEM project is absolutely transparent. So when you go to our website, you'll find all the details in the country graphing tools. You can actually click on these indices and they will break down into the components. So you can really break down all of our indices down to the level of the questions that the country experts actually have to answer. So that way you have the most possible amount of transparency. We even list the number of country experts, so we are really, really transparent. And I also just want to mention that VDEM is not, or the VDEM project is a collaboration of these 3,500 scholars worldwide. So the concepts of democracy that we're using is not an explicitly Western concept. We have a regional center in Asia, for example. We have scholars from all over the world who have contributed to making this data set and who continue to make this data set. So this is truly a global collaborative effort.
In 1 minute, Martin, in 1 minute, do you want to give us your reaction to some of the questions or comments on the panel?
Thank you for the opportunity, but I think Vanessa actually said most of what I would have liked to add anyway. So I think you can continue the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much. You gave me the time I needed because I don't want to cut on the closing remarks time. So I'll begin with Moses. Moses, and I think Moses said it, the other Moses, not the director, the doctor. Moses said it well on the issue of decent jobs. And I know that for the last 3 years, your budget has been speaking to growth with jobs. And so we're not so sure if you're speaking to what Moses says. So you're saying growth is jobs, but it's not decent jobs, but it's jobs in any way. And for you, that's the measure, as Dr. Karieja was saying, and Alana, is that it doesn't matter what the quality is, it's the number. And that speaks to, at the end of the day, will speak to the data that you want. But that's not the data that actually Ugandans are asking for. As we wind up in your closing reflections, where do we go from here?
Thank you, Maurice. First of all, my parting shot to VDEM is that work is good, but I think if you are to do an assessment of me when I don't know the parameters you're going to use, and we have not agreed that these parameters are the ones you should use to judge, to assess me, then there is a problem. We've had, for example, if we're talking about growth, there is a parameter everybody has agreed upon that defines growth. When we look at Human Development Index, there are parameters that are agreed for everybody. But when we look at these parameters, I think they are not agreed. They are good, but for me, I think there is need to broaden them and also agree on them so that where we are not performing well, and we say, yes, this is something we agreed to, we see it's very, very important. But coming up with a report afterwards, it becomes a bit difficult. But having said that, we've talked about jobs. Of course, there are two things, and I agree with you that we need decent jobs. And we are really trying to see how we can ensure that we have decent jobs in this country. One of the things is that you have a lot of people who are coming out, who have of about 800,000 people who get into the job market. And you look at their skills, a lot of them have not been skilled. So if you want a decent job for these people, if you call it decent, I don't know, how would you get them decent jobs? Okay? So what we are looking at and saying, okay, some people, of course, can work at jobs that are not very well paying, but as long as their human rights are recognized, they have right to a holiday, they have, to a leave, working hours are okay, working conditions are good, that we can start and then we negotiate as we go on with the pay, because you won't expect a pay to be as good. It's the market conditions that really determine that. But I agree with you, we really need decent jobs, and for me, in that one I would focus on the working conditions. How good are they? And then we look at the rights of the workers, and then we can talk about more pay, also reflecting the profitability of the business where people are working. I agree with you also when you talked about the budgeting. It is something that every year after the budget, we have supplementaries. And supplementaries really affect the credibility of the budget. And we are emphasizing it in next year's budget, that as much as possible, I won't say we'll rule out supplementaries, but as much as possible, we shall limit the use of supplementaries because they affect budget credibility.
Okay.
And of course, going forward, we are also trying to focus and say, Ugandans, how are they feeling the budget? That's what I said. We want to see that the Ugandans can actually feel the budget.
More participation.
And more
in the budget
participation.
process.
And also feel it, not just to talk about the budget and it stops there, but we want to move in that.
30 seconds.
And then, of course, Samuel was right on, and this is, of course, a debate on democracy and the democracy as it's defined there, as we've been defining it, and growth. Well, there is the determination of the causality that if it hadn't been for addressing those issues of democracy, there would have been no growth in those economies, has not been proven. But I'm not saying that it is wrong, but we are also saying we are aspiring to make sure that we are democratic, but in the way that we all agree that we should be. Thank you.
Okay, I'll come, Prof. If I find some time, I'll come to you. But allow me to ask Alana. You know, as we close, your quick takeout here, and on a positive note, Alana, you've been bashing us quite a bit, and really allowing us to think through some of the information you're sharing. But you know, on a lighter note, where should we be going?
Yeah. Sorry, I think that in moving forward, for us to have any semblance of democracy, we need to get back to the basics, like I've said, and that's getting back to the people, making sure that what we are doing, the public service management and governance, is sustainable, it's accountable, it has a long-term vision, and it affects the future generations. I think we forget that. So when some of us shout about the debt, the country's escalating debt crisis, we're worried about future generations' ability to get health or education. And so we must make sure that we recognize that we are, for those who are policymakers, I always say it's a great privilege. You're taking up space, whether you're a member of parliament or even civil society. And I think that it's very important that the person deep in Amudat begins to feel that they are part of this country. Because I've gone to Amudat and they ask me, is your blood red like mine? We can't both be human. We both can't be from the same country, because why don't we have roads, electricity, healthcare? I was deep in the villages there, and I understood, because we can't continuously to have a situation where we exclude people from the polity of the state. It will not bode well for us. We are tired of war.
All right. Thank you very much, Alana. Prof, apologies, I really have run out of time. But just to really wind this up before we open for closing remarks, I aspire to the drive for democracy that the Embassy of Sweden continues to drive. Critical to this, democracy means that freedom to think, speak, and love who you want. Democracy enables you to make your voice heard and gives you the right to influence and demand accountability. That's what we've been discussing. And democracy provides hope and the conditions to shape a common future in a safe and peaceful society. This among many others in the Drive for Democracy initiative by the Embassy of Sweden in Uganda. This conversation is quite timely, and as we mentioned, this is part of the International Day of Democracy commemoration, which should have been on the 15th, but we did today on the 17th of September. We want to thank you for joining us. So welcome with me, Ms. Anna Merrifield, the Deputy Head of Mission, EU Delegation to Uganda, to come and make closing remarks. You're most welcome, Anna. Round of applause, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be brief. I'm very cognizant of the time. But I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to say a few words at the end of what's been a really, really interesting discussion. Given our firm commitment to democratic values, the European Union is pleased to organize, together with the Embassy of Sweden, this annual event and to once again see a genuine and deep interest in democracy in this country. What to me was most interesting this year is the compelling body of evidence produced by the Varieties of Democracy Institute. Their data shows on a global scale that there's hard evidence for the tangible benefits of democracy and what the benefits that democracy can bring, especially to those who are most vulnerable in our societies. And I have to say, looking at the data set, I'm a political scientist, so I almost wanted to go back to university and look more at those data sets and really to look into them deeply. But I was in university in the 90s when democracy, liberal democracy, was really increasing. It was growing globally, and now we've seen completely the opposite. So I think this data set really shows that we cannot drop our guard in defending democracy anywhere in the world. And I do take note that actually among the top 10 offenders of democracy, where democracy has really been sliding most to autocracy, there were 2 EU member states. So I think we also need to acknowledge as Europeans that there is also this constant pressure on democracies in our own countries, and we need to constantly, as citizens, as voters, also pay attention to that. So I really want to thank Vanessa Bose and Martin Lundstedt from VDEM for their presentations today and for setting the stage for what's been a really, really interesting discussion on their findings and why they also matter in the Ugandan context. I thought the panel discussion was really insightful and too short. I think we can continue that bilaterally, and I really want to offer my heartfelt thanks to our panelists, Moses Kagwa, Alana Kembabazi, and Professor Gerald Karueya. Now, if you allow me, I'd like to pick up on a few points that were raised during the discussion today. First, as noted by Professor Karueya and underlined by Assistant Professor Vanessa Böse, when we look at democracy, we really need to look beyond procedural democracy, especially the elections. I think this is something that we, especially we diplomats, need to pay special attention to. We tend to be a bit sort of we tend to focus a bit too much on elections and too little on some other things. And I really want to echo the points by Ms. Kembabazi that we really need to make democracy relevant to the everyday lives of ordinary people. Democracies don't just lead to greater economic growth and economic inclusion, as we heard from the VDEM results, but economic and social rights are crucial cornerstones of any economy, of any democracy. And I also want to emphasize the point by Mr. Kagwa that it's really crucial that citizens' voices are represented in the budgeting process. So hearing the citizens shouldn't end with the voting process. We fully support these kind of inclusive processes, and as the European Union, we hope that such civil society inclusion can also be strengthening in other areas, which are very crucial to strengthening democracy and well-being, including, for example, civic education and the management of environment. And I would say healthcare as well, which was also mentioned. I think we heard earlier from the VDEM results that those who live in democracies are less likely to die as babies and will actually lead longer lives. So finally, I think a bigger and really interesting issue that came out of the debate, and I think we maybe should hold a bigger debate on it, is about the localizing on the concepts of democracy. I think it really is crucial to implement democracy in a way which is meaningful to the local population. But I think at the same time, we really need to be very cautious that leaders across the globe, some of them may want to use culture as an excuse to limit people's rights and democracy. So there's a very gentle balance, I think, to be struck there. And of course, on that, we need to discuss with the whole civil society on that, on their own wishes. As you all know, democracy and human rights are a keystone of the European Union's foreign policy and partnerships with third countries, including Uganda. We've earlier this year, together with European Union member states in Uganda, developed a new human rights and democracy country strategy for Uganda. And I think we've been consulting a lot with the civil society, with the government officials and private sector on that. And I think I just want to mention that here. I won't go into any of the details of the program. I think you'll hear about that later this year. But it's also a way of us to engage more with various actors on these crucial issues. Because we are convinced that this strong focus on democracy and human rights is a comparative advantage for the European Union. We don't focus on these issues because they're nice to have or because they sound good in a press release. We focus on them because, as we've heard today, they are channels to very tangible socio-economic gains for people and any country as a whole. As most of you will know, the European Union has supported the strengthening of democratic institutions and processes in Uganda for many years. And one avenue for this work is the Democratic Governance Facility. So I just want to echo the words of the Swedish ambassador here. I think we all hope that after a 7-month suspension, a speedy resolution can be found to the freezing of the work of the DGF, so that the vital work of all its really important partners can start or restart. We also urge the government to ensure that the space for civil society is protected. Fostering a strong, vibrant and diverse civil society is one of the essential building blocks of any sustainable, tolerant and resilient multi-party democracy. So the EU urges all stakeholders to work together to ensure that enabling regulation is put in place and that civil society is free to both deliver services that complement the government's efforts and play a vital advocacy and watchdog role. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by stating clearly that the EU's belief in democracy as the best means for all countries to develop and succeed remains unshakable. A strong commitment to dialogue and consensus building amongst all stakeholders is a key component to this. We look forward to our continued engagement with the Ugandan government and civil society on these topics, and we also look forward to many more years of organizing this annual commemoration of the International Day of Democracy. It just remains now for me to thank our co-organizers for this event, the Embassy of Sweden, for their great cooperation as in previous years. And I'd also like to very warmly thank everyone who attended today and everyone who is tuned in and listening to the discussion at home. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna, for your closing remarks. And that said, I can't re-emphasize this more than Anna has. We want to thank the European Union and the Embassy of Sweden here in Uganda for this International Day of Democracy 2021, making the case for democracy. And on behalf of all of us who are here in this room, and keeping the SOPs in mind, and also those who are joining us virtually, we want to thank you for having been part of this 2021 event, and I guess see you next year on the International Day of Democracy. Good afternoon.
Some people think voting is democracy, and once you vote, you come back to it after 5 years. Democracy is much more than voting.
The democratic process doesn't stop at the ballot box, where citizens decide whether to keep their leaders in office or not.
Democracy is the government of people, by the people, for the people.
Kubanga democracy bwe bwenkanya ufune kyenkanyi nange nfune ono afune kyenkanyi.
Democracy nyesi agogong nejai nejas itunga aseoni ibore araswa miso nekotos kesi anejai longa rene kosi.
Democracy clever chol kerama ananian kero bero ni obero tela padano mande pidano.
What democracy means to me is the freedom of the press.
Democracy to me means my ability to be able to decide on who governs me and how.
Democracy to me means the right to choose. The right to choose who governs you, the right to choose the direction, the strategic direction your growth and development should take, and the right to choose health and all the human rights that people are entitled to.
Democracy is about creating opportunity, and it's very difficult to imagine democracy without good governance and the rule of law.
Omuntu yenna ng'alina eddembe lye ng'omuntu kisegera okusinziira ku ki ky'aba ayagala okukola kisa kibanga tekimenya mateeka nga tekinyigiriza muntu mulala.
In my community, I have sensitized the community on respecting human rights and at the same time exercising the human rights, respecting people, respecting children, avoiding things like child labor.
We have a series of lectures and a series of seminars which speak to issues of gender equality, speak to issues of human rights, participation, civic education.
Being the umbrella body of the business community, we have quite a number of diverse partnerships with different backgrounds on gender, environment, business, and so on and so forth. So what we're trying to promote here, beyond profitability, is really shared value. That every individual in the setting that we have as PSFU has got an opportunity to contribute to growth.
Njerizo okuyamba abantu bingi kubagambira about democracy echeru kumanyisa omuntu akateera akarura ka muntu warukwenda tibyo kurwana nkoruga mpoze kugwana mugenzi we ngo kwa yaronda naka ngori ati yamurona ngoze kumutera bene betaba democracy omuntu nabayine obusinje bwe yo kurondo warakundo warenda
utie NTP pikonyo wandano pinu yoremo maro mo bedo ki guak mabe machalo ile mono ge wajo ni security.
The major contribution that any of us can make in my sector is the ability to be able to link with policymakers, to talk to politicians, and to be able to hear their side of the story, but more importantly, to make sure that they hear our side of the story, because we've got the research, we've done the analysis, and therefore probably in a position to be able to support them.
Encouraged a lot of my classmates to join the Uganda Law Society, to join these public debates. Where I work in my other job in National Water, I always encourage my members to get involved in the discussions that affect this country. But I've also encouraged a few of my friends to actually get involved in leadership and stand for office.
In terms of my peers, I've encouraged all of them to begin to imagine that the future they want to live can only be determined by their active participation now in decisions that will determine the kind of society you live in, if there is justice, if there is economic equity, if there is inclusion for minorities and the weakest in our society.
The democratic process, it's an ongoing process with all players in society. That dialogue has to go on throughout the mandate period and not only during campaigning.